In the unforgiving world of military aviation, where split-second decisions determine life and death, some jokes carry consequences that echo far beyond a moment's laughter. What happens when a captain's casual jest to a janitor about starting up a $19 million A-10 Thunderbolt II becomes reality? When the thunderous roar of twin-turbofan engines shatters the morning silence of Nellis Air Force Base, 3 lives will be forever changed, and a simple misunderstanding will spiral into a crisis that threatens careers, challenges protocol, and reveals the extraordinary courage that lies dormant in the most unexpected places. This is the true story of how a moment of workplace humor transformed into a legend that would be whispered in military corridors for decades to come. The Nevada sun had barely crested the horizon when Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez pushed his maintenance cart across the tarmac at Nellis Air Force Base. The wheels squeaked rhythmically against the concrete as he made his way toward the line of A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft that sat like sleeping metal giants in the morning stillness. Each plane represented $19 million of American military engineering, designed to rain destruction on enemy armor and emerge victorious from the most hostile environments imaginable. Miguel had been cleaning these aircraft for 3 years now, ever since his discharge from the Army due to a training injury that left him with a pronounced limp and ended his dreams of becoming a combat soldier. The irony wasn't lost on him that he spent his days maintaining the very type of aircraft that provided close air support to ground forces like the unit he'd once hoped to join. But he'd made peace with his circumstances, finding purpose in ensuring these war machines remained in pristine condition for the pilots who depended on them. The morning routine was always the same. Miguel would start at the far end of the flight line, working his way methodically through each aircraft. External cleaning came first, followed by interior maintenance, and finally a thorough inspection to ensure nothing had been overlooked. It was meticulous work that required attention to detail and respect for the sophisticated machinery that could mean the difference between life and death for American forces in combat zones around the world. As Miguel approached the first A-10 in the line, he noticed Captain James Ace Morrison emerging from the operations building with his characteristic swagger. Morrison was everything Miguel had once aspired to be, a decorated pilot with multiple combat deployments and a reputation for both exceptional skill and an irreverent sense of humor that often walked the fine line between amusing and inappropriate. The captain's flight suit bore the patches and insignia that told the story of a distinguished career, including a distinguished flying cross that he'd earned during a particularly harrowing close air support mission in Afghanistan. Morrison spotted Miguel and changed direction, approaching with the easy confidence that seemed to come naturally to successful fighter pilots. "Morning, Rodriguez," he called out, his voice carrying the slight rasp that came from years of breathing recycled air at high altitudes. "Getting an early start on making my bird pretty?" Miguel straightened up and offered a respectful nod. Despite the informal atmosphere that Morrison cultivated, Miguel never forgot that he was speaking to a commissioned officer whose rank and experience demanded respect.
"Yes, sir."
"Should have her spotless and ready for whatever you've got planned today." Morrison chuckled and walked closer to the aircraft, running his hand along the fuselage with the familiarity of someone who'd spent countless hours strapped into the cockpit. The A-10 was an ungainly-looking aircraft by conventional standards, with its straight wings and twin engines mounted high on the rear fuselage. But Morrison loved everything about the plane's brutal efficiency. It was built around the massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon that formed its spine, a weapon capable of firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate that could shred enemy armor like tissue paper. "You know, Rodriguez," Morrison said, his tone taking on the mischievous quality that his squadron mates had learned to recognize as the prelude to one of his practical jokes. "I've always wondered if you maintenance guys really understand these machines the way we pilots do. I mean, you clean them and service them, but do you really know what makes them tick?" Miguel felt a slight unease creep into his stomach. He'd heard enough stories about Morrison's sense of humor to know that being singled out for this kind of attention rarely ended well for the enlisted personnel involved. But he answered honestly, "I know the basics, sir." "Enough to do my job properly and safely." Morrison's grin widened. "The basics, huh? Well, what if I told you that starting one of these babies is as simple as flipping a few switches, no complex procedures, no lengthy checklists, just a couple of toggles, and you've got yourself a $19 million engine running?" The statement was so absurd that Miguel almost laughed. He'd observed enough pre-flight procedures to know that starting an A-10 involved a comprehensive series of checks and preparations that took trained pilots considerable time to complete safely. But he also recognized the trap that was being laid for him. Morrison was testing him, probably setting up some kind of elaborate joke that would make the rounds in the squadron for weeks to come. "I'm sure it's more complicated than that, sir," Miguel replied carefully. hoping to deflect whatever Morrison had planned. But Morrison was just getting warmed up. He reached into his pocket and produced a small key fob, the kind used to secure sensitive equipment. See this? This is the master key for this particular aircraft. In the old days, you needed actual keys to start these things, but now it's all electronic. One little fob, and all the security systems recognize you as authorized personnel. Miguel knew this wasn't true. The A-10's ignition systems required biometric verification, password authentication, and manual override codes that were changed regularly for security purposes. But Morrison was clearly enjoying himself, and Miguel had learned that the wisest course when dealing with officers in a playful mood was to listen politely and avoid providing ammunition for further mischief. Now, I'm not supposed to tell you this, Morrison continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, but the emergency start procedure for this aircraft is so simple that even a janitor could do it. You just climb into the cockpit, insert this fob into the reader, flip the main power switch, engage the starter, and voila, you've got yourself a running aircraft. The absurdity of the statement was compounded by Morrison's increasingly theatrical delivery. Miguel found himself caught between amusement at the captain's performance and genuine concern about where this was all leading. Sir, I really don't think that's something I should be hearing about. Morrison waved off the concern with a casual gesture. Relax, Rodriguez. It's not like you're actually going to try it. I'm just saying, hypothetically, if there was ever an emergency where you needed to get this aircraft started quickly, you could do it. Simple as changing the light bulb. At that moment, the sound of approaching footsteps caused both men to turn. Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the wing commander, was walking across the tarmac with the measured pace of someone conducting an impromptu inspection. Hawkins was a legend in her own right, one of the first female pilots to fly combat missions in the A-10, and a commander known for maintaining the highest standards of discipline and professionalism in her unit. Morrison's demeanor shifted instantly from playful to professional, his posture straightening and his expression becoming appropriately serious. "Good morning, ma'am," he said, offering a crisp salute as the colonel approached. Hawkins returned the salute and nodded to both men. "Captain Morrison, Sergeant Rodriguez, I trust everything is proceeding according to schedule this morning?" "Yes, ma'am," Morrison replied. "Just discussing maintenance procedures with Sergeant Rodriguez here." Making sure our support personnel understand the importance of their work. Hawkins studied both men for a moment, her experienced eye noting the slight tension in their postures that suggested she'd interrupted something, but she chose not to pursue it immediately. "Excellent. Sergeant Rodriguez, your work has been consistently outstanding. The aircraft in this squadron are among the best maintained in the entire wing." Miguel felt a flush of pride at the recognition. "Thank you, ma'am. I take a lot of pride in keeping these aircraft mission-ready." "As you should," Hawkins replied. She turned her attention back to Morrison. "Captain, I need to see you in my office at 0800 for a briefing on today's training exercise. We have some new parameters that will require adjustments to the flight plan." Morrison nodded. "I'll be there, ma'am." As Hawkins walked away, Morrison turned back to Miguel with a grin that suggested their conversation was far from over. "Where were we?" "Oh yes, the simple art of aircraft ignition. You know what, Rodriguez? I'm so confident in the simplicity of the process that I'm willing to make a little wager." Miguel's sense of unease intensified. "Sir, I really don't think gambling is appropriate."
"Not money," Morrison clarified.
"I'm talking about professional pride. I bet you that if you wanted to, you could walk over to that aircraft right now, climb into the cockpit, and have the engines running in under 5 minutes. No training, no special knowledge required." The challenge hung in the air between them, like an unexploded ordnance. Miguel understood that Morrison wasn't actually expecting him to attempt such a thing, but the pilot's words carried the weight of professional challenge that was difficult for any military member to ignore. The implication was that Morrison's assessment of aircraft systems was so accurate that even an untrained janitor could validate it. "Sir, I appreciate your confidence, but I have no intention of touching any aircraft controls. That's way above my pay grade and outside my area of responsibility." Morrison's grin became positively predatory. "Of course you won't actually do it, Rodriguez. I'm just making the point that modern aircraft systems have been simplified to the point where the old mystique about pilot training being so specialized is becoming obsolete. Any reasonably intelligent person could figure out the basics." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Technical Sergeant Williams, the senior maintenance chief, who approached with a clipboard full of the daily work orders. Williams was a 20-year veteran who commanded respect from both officers and enlisted personnel through his encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft systems and his unwavering commitment to safety protocols. "Morning, Captain Rodriguez," Williams said, nodding to each man in turn. Captain, I wanted to confirm the maintenance schedule for your aircraft today. We've got a routine inspection scheduled for this afternoon, so if you need any additional flight time, we should coordinate now.
Morrison consulted his watch and mental schedule.
Should be fine, Chief. I've got the training exercise this morning and then some administrative time this afternoon. The bird should be available for your inspection by 1400 hours. Williams made a note on his clipboard and turned to Miguel. Rodriguez, when you're finished with the external cleaning, I need you to check the interior environmental systems. We had a report of some minor humidity issues that might need attention. Miguel nodded. Will do, Chief. Should have the external work completed within the hour. As Williams walked away to continue his morning rounds, Morrison leaned closer to Miguel and lowered his voice. See what I mean? Even the maintenance chief assumes that aircraft systems are so reliable that minor issues are worth investigating. But the core systems, the really important stuff like ignition and basic flight controls, they're built to be foolproof. Miguel was growing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Sir, with respect, I think there's a big difference between reliable systems and simple systems. These aircraft represent some of the most sophisticated technology in the world. Sophisticated, yes, Morrison agreed, but also designed for use in combat conditions where complexity can be a liability. Everything about military aircraft is built around the principle of making complex operations as simple and intuitive as possible. The pilot paused and appeared to consider something carefully. Then, with the air of someone making a momentous decision, he reached into his pocket and pulled out the key fob again. You know what, Rodriguez? I'm so confident in my assessment that I'm going to prove it to you. Miguel felt a chill run down his spine. Sir, I really don't think that's necessary. But Morrison was already walking toward the aircraft, motioning for Miguel to follow. Come on, just a quick demonstration. I'll show you exactly how simple the startup sequence is, and you'll understand what I've been talking about. Against his better judgment, Miguel found himself following the captain toward the aircraft. Morrison's enthusiasm was infectious, and despite his reservations, Miguel was genuinely curious about the systems he spent so much time maintaining from the outside. He'd always wondered what the cockpit looked like from the pilot's perspective, how all the switches and displays that he cleaned so carefully actually functioned in practice. Morrison climbed up the ladder to the cockpit with practiced ease, settling into the pilot's seat with the familiarity of someone who'd made the same movement thousands of times. He gestured for Miguel to climb up and look over his shoulder, providing a clear view of the instrument panel that was the nerve center of the aircraft. See this? Morrison pointed to a series of switches on the left side of the cockpit. Master power? Here. Ignition control? There. Engine start sequence? Right here. The whole process is designed so that a pilot under stress, possibly injured, possibly in a combat situation, can get the aircraft running and get airborne with minimal delay. Miguel studied the array of switches, gauges, and displays that filled every available space in the cockpit. Even with Morrison's explanation, the complexity was overwhelming. There were dozens of systems, hundreds of individual controls, and multiple redundant safety mechanisms that seemed designed to prevent exactly the kind of casual operation that Morrison was describing. Sir, this looks incredibly complicated to me. I count at least 50 different switches and controls just in my immediate field of view. Morrison waved dismissively. Most of those are for auxiliary systems. Navigation, weapons control, communication equipment, environmental controls. The basic flight systems are much simpler. He pointed to a specific sequence of switches. Power on. Fuel pumps engaged, ignition sequence initiated. 3 steps and you've got engines running. As Morrison spoke, he was unconsciously going through the motions of the startup sequence, his hands moving towards the appropriate controls with the muscle memory developed through years of repetition.
It was a demonstration that was both impressive in its smoothness and terrifying in its implications.
Of course, Morrison continued, you need the proper authorization codes and biometric verification, so it's not like just anyone could walk up and start one of these things.
But once you have those elements, the actual process is straightforward. Miguel was about to respond when the sound of approaching vehicles caused both men to look toward the flight line operations building. A convoy of black SUVs was pulling up to the main entrance, and even from a distance, Miguel could see the flags and insignia that indicated very high-ranking visitors had arrived at the base. Looks like someone important is here for the exercise today, Morrison observed. Probably some Pentagon brass coming to observe the new tactics we've been developing. The arrival of the VIP convoy seemed to energize Morrison, adding an element of urgency to his demonstration. This is actually perfect timing, Rodriguez. Having important visitors here just emphasizes how critical it is that every member of this team understands their role in keeping these aircraft mission ready. Miguel sensed that the conversation was building towards something that he wasn't going to like. Morrison's tone had shifted from casual joking to something more serious, more purposeful. There was an intensity in the pilot's eyes that suggested his seemingly casual demonstration was leading somewhere specific. "Sir, I think I should get back to my assigned duties. The morning briefing will be starting soon, and I need to have this aircraft properly prepared." But Morrison held up a hand, his expression becoming almost conspiratorial. "Just one more minute, Rodriguez. I want to show you something that will change how you think about your role here." Before Miguel could protest further, Morrison had inserted his key fob into the appropriate reader and began going through what appeared to be the actual startup sequence. The cockpit displays began illuminating in sequence, and the soft hum of electrical systems coming online filled the air around them. "See how simple that is?" Morrison said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "Now, the next step would be to engage the ignition sequence, but obviously we're not going to actually start the engines. This is just a demonstration of how accessible these systems really are." Miguel watched in fascination and growing alarm as the aircraft systems continued to activate around them. Warning lights flashed briefly before settling into steady green indicators, and the multiple display screens showed scrolling text that indicated the aircraft was running through its automated self-diagnostic procedures. "Sir, shouldn't we shut this down? I'm pretty sure we're not supposed to be activating aircraft systems without proper authorization and safety protocols." Morrison's response was cut short by the sudden appearance of Colonel Hawkins, who had apparently noticed the unusual activity and decided to investigate personally. Her expression was a mixture of curiosity and barely controlled anger as she approached the aircraft and looked up at the two men in the cockpit. "Captain Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the morning air. "Would you mind explaining exactly what you're doing?" Captain Morrison's confident demeanor evaporated instantly as Colonel Hawkins's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. The easy swagger that had characterized his interaction with Miguel transformed into the rigid posture of an officer who suddenly realized he might be in serious trouble. From his position in the pilot's seat, Morrison could see the colonel's expression clearly, and it was not the look of someone who was amused by his impromptu demonstration. "Ma'am, I was just showing Sergeant Rodriguez some of the basic aircraft systems," Morrison replied, his voice carrying a forced casualness that fooled no one. "Educational purposes, helping our support personnel understand the equipment they maintain." Colonel Hawkins crossed her arms and took a step closer to the aircraft, her eyes never leaving Morrison's face. "With the master power engaged and the aircraft in active status, that seems like an unusual approach to education, Captain." Miguel felt his stomach drop as he realized the full implications of their situation. What had started as an uncomfortable conversation about aircraft systems had evolved into something that could have serious consequences for both of them. He could see his career flashing before his eyes, 3 years of exemplary service potentially destroyed by his involvement in what was clearly becoming a significant incident. "Ma'am," Miguel interjected, his voice barely steady. "Captain Morrison was explaining how the systems work. I didn't touch anything or authorize any actions. I was just observing." Hawkins shifted her gaze to Miguel, and her expression softened slightly as she recognized the genuine fear in his voice. "Sergeant Rodriguez, please step down from the aircraft immediately. Report to Chief Williams and continue with your assigned duties. We'll discuss your involvement in this incident later." Miguel practically leaped from the aircraft, his relief at being dismissed palpable. But as he hit the tarmac and began walking away, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was abandoning Morrison to face the consequences of something that had spiraled far beyond what either of them had intended. The captain's casual joke about aircraft startup procedures had somehow evolved into an active demonstration that violated multiple regulations and safety protocols. Morrison remained in the cockpit, his hands frozen over the controls as he tried to determine the best way to extract himself from the situation he'd created. The aircraft systems continued to hum around him, each active component a testament to his poor judgment and casual disregard for proper procedures. He could see Hawkins waiting below, her patience clearly wearing thin as she expected an explanation that would somehow make sense of his actions. "Ma'am, I can explain everything," Morrison began, but Hawkins cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Captain, shut down those systems immediately and report to my office. We'll discuss your explanation there, along with a comprehensive review of the regulations you appear to have forgotten." Morrison's training took over as he began the shutdown sequence, his hands moving automatically through the procedures he'd performed countless times. But even this routine action felt different now. weighted with the knowledge that his casual demonstration had become a career-threatening incident. Each switch he flipped seemed to echo in the morning silence, a countdown to consequences he was only beginning to comprehend. As the aircraft systems powered down, Morrison climbed out of the cockpit and dropped to the tarmac with none of the confidence he'd displayed earlier. Colonel Hawkins waited for him, her expression unreadable but ominous. The morning that had started with casual joking and playful demonstrations had become something that would likely follow him for the rest of his military career. "Ma'am, before we go to your office, I want to make it clear that Sergeant Rodriguez bears no responsibility for this incident. I initiated the demonstration entirely on my own authority, and he repeatedly expressed concerns about the appropriateness of our actions." Hawkins studied Morrison's face, looking for any sign of deception or self-serving manipulation. What she saw instead was genuine concern for an enlisted soldier who had been caught up in an officer's poor judgment. It was perhaps the first thing Morrison had done that morning that reflected well on his character and leadership abilities. "That will be taken into consideration, Captain. Now, my office. Immediately." The walk across the tarmac felt like the longest journey of Morrison's career. With each step, he replayed the morning's events, trying to understand how a simple conversation about aircraft systems had evolved into a serious disciplinary incident. His intention had been harmless, a bit of casual education mixed with his characteristic humor. But good intentions were a poor defense against the reality of what he'd actually done. The operations building buzzed with the normal activity of a squadron preparing for a day of training exercises. Pilots reviewed flight plans, maintenance crews coordinated aircraft availability, and administrative personnel managed the countless details that kept a modern Air Force unit functioning effectively. But Morrison noticed that conversations seemed to pause as he passed, and he realized that word of his incident was already beginning to spread through the close-knit community of the base. Colonel Hawkins' office reflected her personality and career achievements. The walls were lined with photographs from her various assignments, commendations for exceptional service, and the accumulated memorabilia of a distinguished military career. Behind her desk hung a large photograph of an A-10 in flight, the aircraft's distinctive profile silhouetted against a desert landscape that Morrison recognized as Afghanistan. Harkins settled behind her desk and gestured for Morrison to take a seat in one of the chairs facing her. The formal arrangement emphasized the gravity of the situation and made it clear that this was not going to be a casual conversation between colleagues. This was an official disciplinary meeting that could determine Morrison's future in the Air Force. "Captain Morrison, I want you to explain, in detail, exactly what happened this morning. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." Morrison took a deep breath and began recounting the events, starting with his casual encounter with Miguel and progressing through the increasingly questionable decisions that had led to the aircraft activation. As he spoke, he could see Hawkins' expression growing progressively more serious, and he realized that his actions looked even worse when described chronologically and objectively. "So, let me understand this correctly," Hawkins said when Morrison finished his account. "You approached an enlisted member of our support staff, engaged him in a discussion about aircraft systems that included false information about startup procedures, and then proceeded to demonstrate those procedures by actually activating an aircraft without proper authorization, safety protocols, or legitimate operational necessity." When summarized so succinctly, Morrison's actions sounded even more responsible than he'd realized. "Ma'am, that's technically accurate, but it doesn't capture the context or my intentions. Captain, your intentions are irrelevant. What matters is your actions and their potential consequences. Do you have any idea what would have happened if you had actually completed the engine startup sequence?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Ma'am, I never intended to actually start the engines. The demonstration was purely educational. But you activated the aircraft's primary systems, engaged the master power, and initiated the preliminary startup sequence. You were 3 steps away from having active engines running on a flight line with personnel working in the immediate vicinity." The colonel leaned forward, her voice taking on a harder edge. "Captain, do you understand that an unauthorized engine start could have resulted in serious injury or death to ground personnel? Do you comprehend the security implications of activating military aircraft without proper clearance? Do you have any grasp of the regulatory violations you've committed?" Morrison felt the weight of his mistakes settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "Yes, ma'am. I understand that my judgment was severely flawed. Your judgment was more than flawed, Captain. Your actions this morning demonstrated a casual disregard for safety protocols, a fundamental misunderstanding of your responsibilities as an officer, and a level of unprofessionalism that calls into question your fitness for continued command. The harsh words hit Morrison like physical blows. Throughout his career, he prided himself on his professionalism and leadership abilities. His casual attitude and irreverent humor had always been balanced by competence and dedication to duty. But this morning's incident had revealed a side of his personality that he hadn't recognized, a tendency toward recklessness that had no place in military aviation.
Ma'am, I accept full responsibility for my actions.
I'm prepared to face whatever consequences are appropriate. Colonel Hawkins studied Morrison's face, looking for signs of genuine understanding and remorse. What she saw was a talented officer who had made a serious mistake, but seemed to grasp the magnitude of his error. It was a combination that presented both opportunities and challenges for her as a commander responsible for maintaining discipline while preserving valuable personnel. Captain, the immediate consequences are clear. You're grounded pending a full investigation of this incident. Your flight status is suspended, and you're relieved of all operational duties until further notice. Morrison felt as though he'd been punched in the stomach. Flying wasn't just his profession, it was his identity, his passion, the defining characteristic of his adult life. The prospect of being grounded indefinitely was almost worse than any other punishment he could imagine. The investigation will examine every aspect of this incident. Hawkins continued. Your actions, your motivations, the potential security implications, and the appropriate disciplinary measures. Depending on the findings, you could face anything from a letter of reprimand to court-martial proceedings. The mention of court-martial sent a chill through Morrison's body. A court-martial could end his career, result in criminal charges, and destroy everything he'd worked to achieve over his years of service. The casual joke that had started the morning now seemed like the first step toward professional and personal disaster. Ma'am, is there anything I can do to mitigate the consequences of my actions? You can cooperate fully with the investigation, demonstrate genuine understanding of your mistakes, and pray that your previous record of service weighs in your favor. Colonel Hawkins leaned back in her chair, her expression softening slightly as she shifted from disciplinary mode to mentoring mode. Captain, you're a talented pilot with a distinguished record of service. But talent doesn't excuse poor judgment, and your record doesn't immunize you from the consequences of serious mistakes. Morrison nodded, understanding that Hawkins was trying to help him see the bigger picture while still holding him accountable for his actions. Ma'am, I understand. I want to learn from this experience and ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. That's exactly the attitude you need to maintain throughout this process. But understand that your career is now in jeopardy, and the outcome of this investigation will determine whether you have a future in the Air Force. The meeting was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Colonel Hawkins called for the visitor to enter, and Chief Williams stepped into the room, his expression grave and his posture indicating that he was the bearer of unwelcome news. Ma'am, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a developing situation that requires immediate attention. Hawkins gestured for Williams to continue, though Morrison noticed that the chief's eyes kept flicking toward him with an expression that suggested whatever was happening was somehow connected to the morning's incident. Ma'am, Sergeant Rodriguez has disappeared from his assigned duties. He was supposed to report to me after your initial conversation, but he never showed up. We've searched the immediate area, but he's nowhere to be found. Morrison felt his stomach clench as he realized that his actions had now apparently impacted Miguel in ways that were far more serious than simple embarrassment or minor disciplinary action. The sergeant's disappearance suggested that he might be facing consequences that Morrison hadn't considered when he'd initiated his casual demonstration. Have you checked with the security police? Has anyone reported seeing him leave the base? Hawkins asked. Ma'am, that's where the situation gets more complicated. The gate guards report that Rodriguez left the base approximately 30 minutes ago, driving his personal vehicle and carrying what appeared to be a small bag of personal belongings. The implications of Williams' report hit both Morrison and Hawkins immediately. Miguel's departure from the base, particularly under these circumstances, suggested either that he was running away from potential consequences or that he had been somehow compromised by the morning's events. Either possibility had serious implications for base security and the ongoing investigation. Chief, I want you to coordinate with the security police to locate Sergeant Rodriguez immediately. This needs to be handled discreetly, but we need to find him and ensure his safety. Williams nodded. Yes, ma'am. Should I also coordinate with off-base law enforcement? Not yet. Let's give our internal resources a chance to locate him first. But be prepared to expand the search if necessary. As Williams left to coordinate the search efforts, Morrison found himself facing a new dimension to his crisis. What had started as a disciplinary incident involving his own poor judgment had now expanded to include a missing soldier whose disappearance might be connected to his actions. Captain, I want you to think very carefully about your interaction with Sergeant Rodriguez this morning. Is there anything you haven't told me? Any indication that he might have been more affected by your demonstration than you initially realized? Morrison replayed the conversation in his mind, searching for any clue that might explain Miguel's disappearance. Ma'am, he seemed uncomfortable with the situation, but not to the extent that I would have expected this kind of reaction. He was professional throughout our interaction and seemed more concerned about proper procedures than anything else. But you said yourself that he repeatedly expressed concerns about the appropriateness of your actions. Perhaps those concerns were more serious than you realized. The possibility that his casual joking had somehow pushed Miguel into a crisis that led to his departure from the base added another layer of guilt to Morrison's growing burden of responsibility. What had seemed like harmless fun between colleagues had apparently had consequences that extended far beyond his own career prospects. Ma'am, what can I do to help find him? Right now, Captain, the best thing you can do is continue to cooperate with the investigation and hope that Sergeant Rodriguez is found quickly and safely. Your immediate priority is preparing for a formal inquiry that will determine the future of your career. As Morrison left Colonel Hawkins' office, he realized that his morning joke had set in motion a series of events that were spiraling beyond anyone's control. The simple demonstration of aircraft systems had become a missing person case, with potential security implications that could affect far more than just his own future. Miguel Rodriguez sat in his beat-up Honda Civic at the edge of a truck stop parking lot, 15 miles from Nellis Air Force Base, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. The small duffel bag containing his most important possessions sat in the passenger seat, a testament to how quickly his life had been turned upside down by a single conversation with Captain Morrison. The morning's events played through his mind in an endless loop, each replay making him feel more confused and desperate. He hadn't intended to leave the base. After Colonel Hawkins had dismissed him from the aircraft and told him to report to Chief Williams, Miguel had started walking toward the maintenance facility with every intention of continuing his duties and hoping the incident would blow over quietly. But with each step, the magnitude of what had happened began to settle into his consciousness like poison spreading through his system. The truth was that Miguel had understood more of Morrison's demonstration than he'd let on. His 3 years of maintaining A-10 aircraft had taught him far more about their systems than anyone realized, and he'd recognized that the captain's casual description of startup procedures was actually frighteningly accurate. The security measures Morrison had dismissed so casually were real, but they weren't as foolproof as the Air Force liked to believe. As Miguel sat in his car, he pulled out his cell phone and stared at the contact information for his older brother Carlos, who lived in Los Angeles and had been encouraging Miguel to leave the military and join his construction business. Carlos had never understood why Miguel had chosen to stay in the service after his injury, especially in a job that kept him so close to the combat role he could never fulfill. Now, for the first time since his enlistment, Miguel was seriously considering taking his brother's advice. The problem was that leaving now, under these circumstances, would look like an admission of guilt for something he wasn't even sure he'd done wrong. Miguel had been a passive participant in Morrison's demonstration, but he understood enough about military justice to know that passive participation could still result in serious consequences. The fact that he'd been present during an unauthorized activation of aircraft systems might be enough to destroy his career, regardless of his actual level of involvement. Miguel's phone rang, startling him out of his brooding. The caller ID showed Chief Williams' number, and Miguel stared at the device for several rings before finally deciding not to answer. He wasn't ready to face the questions that would inevitably come, wasn't prepared to explain his reaction to the morning's events, and wasn't sure he could trust himself to respond appropriately to whatever disciplinary action was being planned. After the phone stopped ringing, Miguel turned his attention back to the problem that had driven him from the base. Morrison's demonstration had revealed something that Miguel had suspected for months but had never been able to confirm. The A-10 startup procedures weren't as secure as everyone believed, and the casual way Morrison had activated the aircraft systems suggested vulnerabilities that could have serious implications for base security. Miguel had noticed irregularities in the aircraft security systems during his maintenance work, small inconsistencies that didn't make sense if the safeguards were functioning as designed. Access panels that should have been locked were sometimes found unsecured. Electronic systems occasionally showed signs of unauthorized activation. Equipment manifests sometimes didn't match the actual configuration of installed components. Each incident had been minor enough to explain away individually, but taken together, they suggested a pattern that was deeply troubling. The realization that had driven Miguel from the base was the understanding that Morrison's casual demonstration might have been more than just a joke. The captain's knowledge of bypass procedures and security vulnerabilities was too detailed, too accurate to have come from normal operational training. It suggested access to information and systems that went beyond what a pilot would typically need. and Miguel couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled into something much more serious than a disciplinary incident. Miguel's paranoia was interrupted by the sight of a black SUV pulling into the truck stop parking lot. The vehicle moved with the purposeful efficiency that Miguel had learned to associate with military security personnel, and he felt his heart rate spike as he realized that his disappearance from the base had apparently triggered a search operation. He slumped down in his seat, hoping the tinted windows and distance would provide enough concealment to avoid immediate detection. The SUV parked near the truck stop entrance, and Miguel watched as two men in civilian clothes emerged and began what appeared to be a systematic search of the parking area. They moved with the practiced efficiency of professionals, checking license plates and peering into vehicles with the thoroughness that suggested they were looking for someone specific. Miguel realized that his time for indecision was running out rapidly. As the search team worked their way across the parking lot, Miguel made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life forever. Instead of waiting to be found and brought back to face whatever consequences awaited him, he started his car and pulled out of the truck stop, heading toward Interstate 15 and the uncertain future that lay beyond the reach of military authority. The drive toward Los Angeles felt like a journey into exile, each mile taking Miguel further from the life he'd built and the career that had given him purpose despite its limitations. He'd never been one to run from problems, but the morning's events had revealed complexities that he wasn't equipped to handle alone. Morrison's casual demonstration had opened a door to questions that Miguel wasn't qualified to answer, and his instincts told him that trying to answer them within the military system would only make his situation worse. Meanwhile, back at Nellis Air Force Base, Colonel Hawkins was dealing with a crisis that was expanding far beyond the simple disciplinary matter she'd initially anticipated. The search for Miguel Rodriguez had revealed troubling information that transformed the morning's aircraft activation from a routine violation of protocol into something with potential national security implications. Chief Williams had reported that Rodriguez's workstation contained materials that shouldn't have been there. Technical manuals and system diagrams that went far beyond what a maintenance technician would need for his assigned duties. More disturbing was the discovery of handwritten notes that documented irregularities in aircraft security systems, observations that suggested someone had been systematically studying vulnerabilities in the base's most sensitive equipment. "Ma'am," Williams said as he briefed Hawkins on the search findings, "these notes suggest that Rodriguez has been documenting security weaknesses for months. Some of these observations are things that only someone with intimate knowledge of our systems would notice." Hawkins studied the materials spread across her desk, trying to understand how a simple maintenance technician had acquired such detailed knowledge of aircraft security systems.
Chief, has Rodriguez ever been assigned to duties that would give him access to this level of information?
No, ma'am. His clearance level and job assignments wouldn't normally provide access to these technical details.
The fact that he has this information suggests either unauthorized access to classified materials or contact with someone who provided it to him. The implications were staggering. If Rodriguez had been systematically documenting security vulnerabilities, either for personal reasons or at the direction of outside parties, then Morrison's demonstration might have been the trigger that exposed a much larger security breach. Alternatively, Rodriguez might have been an innocent observer whose maintenance work had revealed genuine problems that the Air Force needed to address urgently. Chief, I want you to coordinate with Base Security and the Office of Special Investigations. We need a comprehensive review of Rodriguez's access to aircraft and systems over the past 6 months. If there are security vulnerabilities that he's documented, we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Williams nodded grimly. "Ma'am, should we also review Captain Morrison's access and activities? If Rodriguez was documenting security problems, Morrison's knowledge of bypass procedures might not be coincidental." The suggestion that Morrison might be involved in something more serious than poor judgment sent a chill through Hawkins' office.
The captain's casual demonstration of aircraft activation procedures had seemed like simple recklessness, but in light of Rodriguez's documented observations, it might represent something far more sinister. Yes, initiate a parallel investigation of Captain Morrison's activities and access patterns.
I want to understand exactly how he acquired the knowledge he demonstrated this morning, and whether his interaction with Rodriguez was as casual as he claimed. As the investigation began to expand, Captain Morrison found himself confined to quarters and facing questions that went far beyond simple disciplinary matters. Air Force investigators had arrived within hours of Rodriguez's disappearance, and their line of inquiry suggested that they suspected something much more serious than unauthorized aircraft activation. "Captain Morrison," said Agent Sarah Chen, a civilian investigator from the Office of Special Investigations, "we need to understand exactly how you acquired the knowledge you demonstrated this morning."
The procedures you showed Sergeant Rodriguez aren't part of standard pilot training, and they suggest access to classified technical information.
Morrison sat in the base legal office. a military lawyer at his side, trying to understand how his morning joke had evolved into what appeared to be a national security investigation.
Ma'am, I acquired that knowledge through normal operational experience and informal discussions with maintenance personnel. There's nothing classified or unusual about understanding aircraft systems. Agent Chen consulted her notes, her expression suggesting skepticism about Morrison's explanation. Captain, the specific procedures you described require knowledge of security bypass codes and system vulnerabilities that aren't part of normal operational training. Can you explain how you acquired such detailed information? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Morrison realized that his casual demonstration had revealed knowledge that he'd accumulated over years of flying and maintaining aircraft without considering its sensitivity. The informal information sharing that was common among pilots and maintenance crews had provided him with insights into aircraft systems that apparently crossed into classified territory. Ma'am, I can't point to a specific source for that information. It's the kind of knowledge that accumulates over years of working with aircraft and discussing technical issues with experienced personnel. So you're saying that classified information about aircraft security systems is casually shared among personnel without regard for clearance levels or need-to-know requirements? Morrison's lawyer leaned forward, recognizing that his client was walking into a trap that could have serious consequences. Agent Chen, my client has been fully cooperative with this investigation. If you're suggesting that there are systemic security problems at this base, that's an issue that goes far beyond Captain Morrison's actions this morning. Agent Chen acknowledged the lawyer's point, but continued her line of questioning. Captain, can you explain your relationship with Sergeant Rodriguez? How long have you known him, and what was the nature of your interactions prior to this morning? Morrison thought back through his limited interactions with Miguel, trying to remember conversations and encounters that had seemed routine at the time but might now be viewed with suspicion. Ma'am, I've known Rodriguez for approximately 2 years, since he was assigned to maintenance duties for aircraft in my squadron. Our interactions have been limited to routine operational matters and casual conversation. Have you ever discussed aircraft systems or security procedures with him before today?
Not in any detail. Today's conversation was the first time I'd ever talked to him about startup procedures or technical matters.
Agent Chen made notes that suggested Morrison's answers were being evaluated against information from other sources. Captain, we have evidence that suggests Rodriguez had been documenting aircraft security vulnerabilities for several months. Are you aware of any observations or concerns he might have shared with other personnel? The revelation that Miguel had been systematically documenting security problems added another dimension to Morrison's understanding of the crisis. His casual demonstration hadn't just violated protocol, it had apparently confirmed suspicions or observations that Miguel had been harboring for months. Ma'am, I had no knowledge of any security concerns that Rodriguez might have identified. If he was documenting problems, he never shared that information with me. As the investigation continued, the scope of the crisis became increasingly clear. Miguel Rodriguez's disappearance had revealed a pattern of security vulnerabilities that went far beyond the morning's aircraft activation incident. His documented observations suggested systematic problems with aircraft security systems that had either been overlooked by official channels or deliberately concealed by personnel with access to sensitive information. The search for Miguel intensified as investigators realized that his knowledge of base security vulnerabilities made him either a valuable witness to serious problems or a potential security risk who needed to be located immediately. His documented observations contained information that could compromise aircraft security, not just at Nellis, but at Air Force installations around the world. Colonel Hawkins found herself managing a crisis that threatened to expose systemic failures in aircraft security while dealing with the political implications of having such problems discovered by a maintenance technician rather than through official channels. The morning's simple joke had uncovered a web of security issues that could have far-reaching consequences for Air Force operations and personnel. As evening approached, the sound that would define the crisis finally emerged from the controlled chaos of the investigation. The deep, thunderous roar of A-10 engines starting up echoed across the base. But this wasn't a routine training exercise or maintenance operation. Someone had actually succeeded in starting one of the aircraft using the very procedures that Morrison had so casually described, and the implications of that success would reverberate through the highest levels of the Pentagon. The thunderous roar of twin TF-34 engines spooling up to full power shattered the evening quiet of Nellis Air Force Base like a sonic bomb detonating in the middle of a library. Colonel Patricia Hawkins was in the middle of reviewing security footage when the unmistakable sound reached her office, causing her to freeze mid-motion as the implications crashed over her like a tsunami of dread. For a moment, she hoped against hope that the sound represented a scheduled training exercise that had somehow escaped her notice. But one glance at the evening operations board confirmed her worst fears. There were no authorized aircraft starts scheduled for the next 4 hours. The sound echoing across the base represented the materialization of every nightmare scenario that the morning's investigation had been designed to prevent. Chief Williams to Colonel Hawkins, emergency channel. The radio crackled with barely controlled panic as Williams' voice cut through the engine noise that was growing louder by the second. Ma'am, we have an unauthorized aircraft startup on the flight line. A-10 tail number 7. 80651 is showing active engines with no pilot assigned and no flight plan filed. Hawkins grabbed her radio while simultaneously reaching for her phone to initiate base-wide emergency protocols. Chief, confirm current personnel location. Who has access to that aircraft? Ma'am, that's the problem. The aircraft is in a restricted maintenance area that should be completely secured. Our logs show no authorized personnel in that sector, but someone is definitely operating that aircraft. The colonel's mind raced through the possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. An unauthorized aircraft startup represented a potential security breach of the highest order, with implications that ranged from simple theft to potential terrorist action. The fact that the aircraft in question was a fully armed A-10 Thunderbolt II made the situation exponentially more dangerous. Chief, initiate code red security protocols immediately. I want that area surrounded and the aircraft disabled if possible. Coordinate with base security and the tower to ensure no unauthorized takeoff occurs. As Hawkins spoke, she was already moving toward her office door, grabbing her service weapon and emergency equipment while coordinating the response to what could be the most serious security incident in the base's history. The morning's investigation into Morrison's demonstration had revealed vulnerabilities in aircraft security systems, but no one had anticipated that those vulnerabilities could be exploited so quickly and dramatically. The flight line had transformed into a scene of controlled chaos as security personnel, firefighters, and maintenance crews converged on the area surrounding the active aircraft. Emergency vehicles with flashing lights created a perimeter around the A-10, their presence emphasized by the continued roar of engines that should not have been running. From a safe distance, Colonel Hawkins could see the aircraft clearly. The A-10 sat on the tarmac with its engines at idle power, the familiar blue-white glow of the exhaust creating an eerie illumination in the gathering dusk. Most disturbing was the fact that the cockpit appeared to be occupied, though the distance and angle made it impossible to identify who was controlling the aircraft. Tower, this is Base Commander Hawkins, she spoke into a radio. What's the status on communication with the aircraft? Has anyone responded to our attempts to establish contact? Ma'am, this is Tower Supervisor Martinez. We've been attempting radio contact for the past 5 minutes with no response. The aircraft is not responding to any frequency, and we have no flight plan or authorization for this activation. The lack of communication added another layer of concern to an already critical situation. If whoever was operating the aircraft was refusing to respond to radio calls, it suggested either hostile intent or a situation so serious that normal protocols had been abandoned entirely.
Ma'am, came Chief Williams' voice over the radio. We've identified the operator.
Security cameras show that it's Sergeant Rodriguez. He's in the cockpit and he appears to be going through some kind of systematic procedure. The revelation that Miguel Rodriguez had returned to the base and somehow gained access to the restricted aircraft hit Hawkins like a physical blow. The missing maintenance technician had not only come back, but had apparently used the knowledge gained from Morrison's demonstration to actually start one of the aircraft he'd been maintaining for years. Chief, how did he gain access to the restricted area? That sector should be secured and monitored at all times. Ma'am, preliminary reports suggest he used his maintenance credentials to bypass security checkpoints. His access codes were still active in the system, and he apparently knew the patrol schedules well enough to avoid direct contact with security personnel. The fact that Rodriguez had used illegitimate access credentials to reach the aircraft raised disturbing questions about the effectiveness of base security measures. His maintenance position had provided him with detailed knowledge of security procedures and access systems that he'd apparently used to circumvent multiple layers of protection. What's his current status? Is he attempting to taxi or prepare for takeoff? Ma'am, he appears to be running through pre-flight checks. The aircraft systems are active, but he hasn't attempted to move from his current position. It's almost like he's waiting for something. Colonel Hawkins studied the distant aircraft, trying to understand Rodriguez's motivations and objectives. The fact that he'd successfully started the engines proved that Morrison's casual demonstration had revealed genuine security vulnerabilities. But Rodriguez's current behavior suggested something more complex than simple theft or sabotage. Chief, I want you to coordinate with the negotiation team. If Rodriguez is waiting for something, we need to establish communication and understand what he wants before the situation escalates further. As emergency personnel continued to establish their perimeter, Agent Sarah Chen arrived at Hawkins' position with information that added new dimensions to the crisis. Colonel, we've analyzed Rodriguez's documented observations, and they indicate security problems that go far beyond what we initially suspected. Hawkins turned her attention to Chen while keeping one eye on the active aircraft. Agent Chen, what exactly did Rodriguez document? His notes indicate systematic vulnerabilities in aircraft security systems, unauthorized access to classified technical information, and evidence of possible insider threats within the maintenance organization. His observations suggest that someone with high-level access has been deliberately weakening security protocols. The implications were staggering. If Rodriguez's documentation was accurate, then the base had been dealing with a security breach that went far beyond one maintenance technician's observations. Someone with significant authority had apparently been systematically compromising aircraft security, and Rodriguez's amateur investigation had uncovered evidence of a much larger problem. Agent Chen, does Rodriguez's documentation implicate specific individuals? The notes are careful not to make direct accusations, but they document activities and access patterns that point toward personnel with security clearances and administrative authority. Rodriguez appears to have been building a case rather than just making random observations.
As they spoke, the situation on the flight line took a new turn.
The A-10's engines began spooling up to higher power levels, and the aircraft started moving slowly forward along the taxiway. Rodriguez had apparently completed whatever preparation he'd been conducting, and was now actively operating the aircraft. Tower, this is Base Commander. Has the aircraft responded to any communication attempts? Negative, ma'am. All frequencies remain silent, but we're detecting electronic emissions that suggest the aircraft's communication systems are active. He's receiving our transmissions but choosing not to respond. The fact that Rodriguez was monitoring communications while refusing to respond suggested a level of intentionality that went beyond panic or confusion. He was making deliberate choices about his actions, which meant he had specific objectives that he was working toward. Chief Williams, what's the aircraft's current heading and speed? Ma'am, he's moving toward the main runway at taxi speed. If he reaches the runway and attempts takeoff, we'll have a fully armed military aircraft under unauthorized control. The prospect of an armed A-10 being stolen or hijacked represented a national security crisis of the highest order. The aircraft's weapons systems included a 30mm GAU, 8 Avenger cannon capable of destroying armored vehicles, and a full complement of air-to-ground missiles that could cause massive destruction to civilian or military targets. Initiate runway denial procedures immediately, Hawkins ordered. If Rodriguez reaches the runway, I want barriers in place that will prevent takeoff. As emergency crews scrambled to block the runway with vehicles and equipment, Colonel Hawkins found herself facing the most serious crisis of her career. The morning's investigation into Morrison's demonstration had revealed security vulnerabilities that someone was now exploiting in real time, with consequences that could extend far beyond Nellis Air Force Base. Agent Chen, based on Rodriguez's documentation, who would have the authority and access necessary to systematically weaken aircraft security? Colonel, the evidence points towards someone with administrative control over security protocols, probably at the wing or group level. The modifications that Rodriguez documented would require high-level access codes and the ability to make changes without triggering automatic security alerts. As they spoke, a new voice cut through the radio chatter with information that changed everything. Base Commander, this is Security Investigation Team Leader Johnson. We have urgent intelligence that requires immediate attention. Hawkins keyed her radio. Go ahead, Johnson. Ma'am. Our investigation of Captain Morrison's activities has revealed communications with external parties that occurred shortly before this morning's aircraft demonstration. Phone records show contact with individuals who may have been directing his actions. The revelation that Morrison might have been acting under outside direction rather than simple poor judgment added another layer of complexity to the crisis. If the captain had been deliberately demonstrating security vulnerabilities to Rodriguez as part of a larger operation, then the entire morning's events took on a different character. Johnson, what's the nature of these external contacts?
Ma'am, preliminary analysis suggests coordination with parties who had advanced knowledge of Rodriguez's security observations.
Morrison's demonstration may have been designed to confirm information that had already been provided to outside parties. Colonel Hawkins felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she realized that the crisis was far more complex than anyone had initially understood. Rodriguez's unauthorized aircraft operation might not be the desperate act of a panicked maintenance technician, but rather the culmination of a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been months in the making.
Agent Chen, if this is a coordinated operation, what would be Rodriguez's likely objective?
Colonel, based on the pattern of his documented observations, Rodriguez might be attempting to demonstrate security vulnerabilities to expose the larger problem he's uncovered. His actions could be whistleblowing rather than theft or sabotage.
The possibility that Rodriguez was attempting to expose security problems rather than exploit them provided a new perspective on his motivations, but it didn't reduce the immediate danger of the situation. Regardless of his intentions, he was operating a military aircraft without authorization, and the potential for catastrophic consequences remained unchanged. "Ma'am," came Chief Williams' voice over the radio. "Rodriguez has reached the runway threshold. He's positioning the aircraft for what appears to be a takeoff attempt." Hawkins watched in horror as the A-10 aligned itself with the main runway, its engines increasing to takeoff power levels that created a thunderous roar across the entire base. Despite the emergency vehicles and barriers that had been positioned to prevent takeoff, Rodriguez appeared determined to attempt flight operations that would transform the crisis from a base security incident into a potential national catastrophe. "All units prepare for interdiction procedures," Hawkins commanded. "If that aircraft attempts takeoff, we may have no choice but to disable it by any means necessary." The words felt like lead in her mouth as she spoke them. The prospect of having to destroy an American military aircraft to prevent its unauthorized flight represented the ultimate failure of command and security procedures. But with each passing second, it became increasingly clear that Rodriguez was committed to a course of action that would force impossible choices on everyone involved in the crisis response. The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat at the end of runway 21L like a caged predator, its twin engines cycling through power settings that sent waves of heat distortion rippling across the desert landscape. In the cockpit, Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez's hands moved across the controls with a precision that belied his maintenance background, each switch activation and system check performed with the methodical care of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and why. Colonel Patricia Hawkins stood 200 meters away behind the improvised command post that had been established in the shadow of a hangar, her mind racing through options that seemed to grow more limited with each passing minute. The runway denial barriers had been positioned, emergency response teams were in place, and 2 F-16 Fighting Falcons from the neighboring squadron were being prepared for what might become the most tragic air-to-air engagement in American military history.
"Colonel," Agent Sarah Chen said, approaching with a tablet displaying the latest intelligence analysis, "we've decoded more of Rodriguez's documentation, and the picture it presents is significantly different from what we initially suspected." Hawkins accepted the tablet without taking her eyes off the distant aircraft.
"Agent Chen, unless this information provides a way to resolve the current crisis, I'm not sure it's relevant to our immediate situation."
"Ma'am, it's directly relevant because it explains Rodriguez's actions and provides insight into how this situation might be resolved without loss of life or aircraft."
For the first time since the crisis began, Hawkins allowed herself to focus completely on Chen's briefing.
"Explain." Chen activated a series of documents on the tablet, each one representing months of careful observation and analysis that Rodriguez had conducted during his maintenance duties. Rodriguez wasn't just documenting security vulnerabilities for personal interest or potential exploitation. He was building evidence of a systematic campaign to compromise aircraft security by someone with administrative authority. The colonel studied the documents, noting the methodical approach and professional quality of Rodriguez's observations. These are incredibly detailed and well organized. This level of documentation suggests formal training in intelligence analysis.
"That's because Rodriguez has formal training in intelligence analysis," Chen continued. "Before his injury and transfer to maintenance duties, he was a military intelligence specialist with clearance levels that provided access to security protocols and threat assessment procedures." The revelation hit Hawkins like a physical blow as she realized that Rodriguez's background had been incompletely understood throughout the entire crisis. His maintenance position had been the result of medical limitations, not his original military specialty. His knowledge of aircraft systems came not just from 3 years of cleaning and servicing, but from formal training in exactly the kind of intelligence work that his documentation represented. "Agent Chen, why wasn't this information available during our initial investigation?" His medical records and job history were classified at a level that required special access clearance. When he was transferred to maintenance duties, the classification remained in place to protect the sensitive nature of his previous assignments.
As Chen spoke, Rodriguez's voice finally broke the radio silence that had persisted throughout the crisis.
His transmission was calm, professional, and completely unexpected in its content and tone. "Base Commander, this is Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. I am requesting immediate secure communication with Colonel Hawkins and Agent Chen. I have critical intelligence regarding base security that requires immediate command attention. Hawkins keyed her radio with hands that trembled slightly from the adrenaline that had been building throughout the crisis. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Colonel Hawkins. You are operating military equipment without authorization and in violation of multiple regulations. Shut down your engines immediately and prepare for security personnel to escort you from the aircraft. Rodriguez's response was patient but firm. Ma'am, with respect, I cannot comply with that order until I have communicated critical security intelligence that affects the safety of this base and potentially other installations throughout the Air Force. Sergeant, you can communicate that intelligence through proper channels after you have shut down the aircraft and submitted to appropriate security procedures. Colonel, the intelligence I possess indicates that proper channels have been compromised. The individual responsible for the security vulnerabilities I've documented has administrative authority that would allow them to suppress or redirect any information I provide through normal procedures. The implication that someone in a position of authority was actively working to compromise base security transformed the crisis from an unauthorized aircraft operation into a potential counterintelligence emergency. If Rodriguez's assessment was accurate, then normal procedures might indeed be inadequate to ensure that critical information reached the appropriate authorities. Sergeant Rodriguez, can you provide the identity of the individual you suspect? There was a long pause before Rodriguez responded, during which the only sound was the continued idling of the A-10's engines. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of months of careful investigation and analysis. Ma'am, my documentation indicates that Captain Morrison's demonstration this morning was not an isolated incident of poor judgment. His knowledge of security bypass procedures and his interaction with me were part of a systematic effort to test and exploit vulnerabilities that have been deliberately introduced into aircraft security systems. Colonel Hawkins felt the pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to fall into place as she realized that Morrison's casual demonstration might have been anything but casual. Sergeant, are you suggesting that Captain Morrison was deliberately testing security vulnerabilities?
Ma'am, Captain Morrison has been in communication with external parties who have specific interest in A-10 security systems.
His demonstration was designed to confirm that the vulnerabilities I documented could be exploited by personnel with minimal training and access. As Rodriguez spoke, Agent Chen was coordinating with her investigative team to verify the intelligence he was providing. The pattern of communications and activities that emerged painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that had been using Morrison's position and access to gather intelligence about American military aviation security. Sergeant Rodriguez, Hawkins said, if you have evidence of Captain Morrison's involvement in intelligence activities, why didn't you report it through appropriate channels before taking unauthorized action? Rodriguez's response revealed the depth of his dilemma and the careful consideration that had led to his dramatic demonstration. Ma'am, Captain Morrison's handler within the base has administrative authority that would have allowed him to suppress any reports I made through normal channels. My documentation indicates that this individual has been facilitating Morrison's activities for months. The suggestion that Morrison had a handler within the base leadership structure sent chills through both Hawkins and Chen as they realized the scope of the security breach they were dealing with. If Rodriguez was correct, then the base had been infiltrated at levels that could compromise operations far beyond Nellis. Sergeant, can you identify Morrison's handler? Again, Rodriguez paused before responding. And when he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of accusations that would forever change the command structure of the base. Ma'am, the individual facilitating Captain Morrison's intelligence activities is Chief Williams. His position as senior maintenance supervisor provided the access necessary to modify security protocols and create the vulnerabilities that Morrison was tasked to exploit and document. The accusation against Chief Williams hit Colonel Hawkins like a physical blow as she realized that the man she'd been relying on throughout the crisis might be the very person responsible for creating it. Williams had been involved in every aspect of the investigation, had provided information about Rodriguez's activities, and had coordinated security responses that might have been designed to protect Morrison and suppress evidence of the larger operation. Agent Chen, Hawkins said, her voice barely controlled. Where is Chief Williams currently located? Chen checked her radio and coordination boards before responding with obvious concern. Ma'am, Chief Williams left his assigned position approximately 20 minutes ago. His current location is unknown, and he's not responding to radio calls. The realization that Williams had disappeared during the crisis added weight to Rodriguez's accusations and suggested that the chief might be attempting to escape or destroy evidence of his involvement in the intelligence operation. His intimate knowledge of base operations and security procedures would make him extremely difficult to locate if he was actively evading capture. Sergeant Rodriguez, Hawkins transmitted. Assuming your intelligence is accurate, why was it necessary to start the aircraft? Couldn't you have provided this information without creating the current crisis? Rodriguez's response revealed the careful calculation that had led to his dramatic demonstration. Ma'am, starting the aircraft serves three purposes. First, it proves that the security vulnerabilities are real and exploitable. Second, it ensures that my intelligence receives immediate attention at the highest levels. Third, it provides protection for me until the investigation can be completed and appropriate security measures implemented. The logic was sound, if unconventional. By creating a crisis that demanded immediate attention from senior leadership and federal investigators, Rodriguez had ensured that his intelligence couldn't be suppressed or redirected by compromised personnel within the base command structure. Sergeant, are you prepared to shut down the aircraft and provide your intelligence through secure channels now that appropriate authorities are involved? Ma'am, I am prepared to cooperate fully, but I need assurance that Chief Williams and Captain Morrison will be secured before I power down the aircraft. Their continued freedom represents a security risk that could compromise the investigation. As if summoned by Rodriguez's words, Chief Williams' voice suddenly cut through the radio traffic with a transmission that confirmed the sergeant's worst fears about the scope of the conspiracy. All units, this is Chief Williams. Sergeant Rodriguez represents a clear and present danger to base security. I am authorizing immediate action to disable the aircraft by any means necessary. The unauthorized command from Williams, who had no authority to issue such orders, revealed both his involvement in the conspiracy and his desperation to prevent Rodriguez from exposing the full extent of the intelligence operation. His attempt to trigger aggressive action against the aircraft was a clear indication that Rodriguez's accusations were accurate. Disregard that transmission, Colonel Hawkins commanded immediately. Chief Williams is relieved of duty and is to be located and detained immediately. No action will be taken against the aircraft without my direct authorization. But the damage had been partially done. Rodriguez's voice came over the radio with new urgency as he apparently detected activity that suggested Williams' order might be acted upon by personnel who were unaware of his compromised status. Colonel Hawkins, I'm detecting movement of personnel and equipment that suggests preparation for aggressive action against my position. If this aircraft is attacked, critical intelligence about base security will be lost, along with evidence of a conspiracy that extends beyond this installation. Hawkins realized that she was racing against time to prevent a catastrophic escalation that could result in the destruction of the aircraft, the loss of Rodriguez's life, and the suppression of intelligence that was crucial to national security. All units, this is Base Commander Hawkins. Any personnel receiving orders from Chief Williams are to disregard those orders immediately. Chief Williams is under investigation and no longer has operational authority. Sergeant Rodriguez is to be treated as a cooperative witness, not as a hostile threat. As security teams began searching for Williams and Morrison, Rodriguez finally began the shutdown procedures that would end the most dramatic whistleblowing incident in military aviation history. The A-10's engines wound down gradually, their thunderous roar diminishing to a whisper that seemed to echo the conclusion of a crisis that had revealed corruption and conspiracy at the highest levels of base operations. Colonel Hawkins, Rodriguez transmitted as the aircraft systems powered down, I am prepared to provide full cooperation and testimony regarding the security vulnerabilities and intelligence activities I have documented. I apologize for the dramatic nature of my disclosure, but I believed it was the only way to ensure that this information reached appropriate authorities without being suppressed. As Rodriguez climbed down from the cockpit and surrendered himself to federal agents, Colonel Hawkins reflected on a morning that had started with a simple joke about aircraft startup procedures and evolved into the exposure of a sophisticated intelligence operation that had compromised one of America's most important military installations. The investigation that followed would reveal the full extent of Morrison and Williams' activities, leading to court-martial, federal prosecutions, and a comprehensive overhaul of aircraft security procedures throughout the Air Force. Rodriguez's dramatic demonstration had prevented the compromise of critical military technology and exposed vulnerabilities that could have had devastating consequences for American military operations worldwide. Years later, when Rodriguez received a commendation for his actions and was promoted to his original intelligence specialty, Colonel Hawkins would reflect that sometimes the most important truths emerge not through proper channels, but through the courage of individuals willing to risk everything to protect the institutions they serve. The sound of those A-10 engines starting up without authorization had indeed been thunder, but it was the thunder that clears the air and makes way for clearer skies ahead.